now here's Sydney with her expertise on the economic standings of the Union. Thank you, and I'm Sydney with your economic information about the 1863s. As we all know, the economy during the 1800s has moved heavily towards the industrial and far away from the agricultural, except for in the South. The Industrial Revolution began north of the Mason-Dixon line, leaving the South behind. Although the South is still producing over 2/3 of the U.S. cotton exports, they are not moving towards industrial. Now we have northern states advancing to a commercial and manufacturing economy, producing 7 times more cotton and 32 times more firearms. It produced 3,200 firearms to every 100 produced in the South. There was great wealth in the South with the slave economy, but the North soared even more with the Industrial Revolution relating to the firearms in the war. In the South, it was smaller industrial based, but forced upon the slave labor. Therefore, since there were fewer rail lines, it was harder to move resources needed for the war, which is why the Union had a greater advantage with more railroads. Advancement of the Northern led to mass urbanization with over 26% of their population living in growing cities. The North attracted immigration with over 23 million immigrants moving to the Union versus 9 million in the Confederate. In February 1863, the National Banking Act established many national banks in the North. This provided a sound currency for industrial expansion. In 1863, the Southern economy that is completely tied to the export of cotton had majorly crashed, and this led to no way for them to get badly needed war supplies. And now, Avery, our socioculture expert and our biographic critic.
Hello! I'm Avery Thorne. Since the war has started, the culture of our country has changed drastically. As the war has dragged on, the soldiers' lives have been one of constant hardship and deprivation. From ragged clothing and equipment to barely edible and usually insufficient rations. Many of the soldiers tried to distract themselves from these hardships by singing and playing instruments. I'm sure you all have been looking closely in the newspapers because they have been distributed more than ever. They feature reports directly from the battlefield and photographs bringing the horrific imagery of the war into urban centers of the North. Another topic that has become more common to talk about since the war is slaves. According to the census taken 3 years ago, the total population of the country was close to 31,500,000. There were no slaves in 19 states and only 2 in Kansas and 15 in Nebraska. 4 million slaves inhabited 15 states and territories. Delaware had 1,798, Maryland held 87,189, and Virginia had the most, with 490,865 slaves, owned by 52,128 slaveholders. There were 3,181 slaves in Washington, D.C. It is not usually recognized that in the southern states, along with the 4 million slaves, there are about 400,000 free African Americans. While they do not have equal rights, many are successful business people, and some are slaveholders themselves. All over the battlefront, runaway slaves are beginning to present themselves to Union forces. The Union has instituted a policy of hiring and using them in the war effort. 2 years ago, the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1861, making legal the status of runaway slaves. Congress also passed a law in March of last year prohibiting the return of slaves. As Union forces drove the Confederates out of Maryland, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It stated that if the Southern states did not cease their rebellion Sorry for that interruption. It stated that if the Southern states did not cease their rebellion by January 1st of this year, then the slaves in those states would be free. When the Confederacy did not yield, President Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of this past year. The proclamation freed only the slaves in the states in rebellion against the federal government. It did not free the slaves held in the U.S. Through this past year, there have been many leaders that have influenced our country for both the good and the bad. I will be rating a few of these men on a scale of 1 to 5. The first man on this list is General Joseph Hooker. Hooker was appointed in 1861 as a brigadier general of the Union Army. He began the war commanding a division of the Army of the Potomac around Washington, D.C. under Major General George McClellan. In 1862, Hooker commanded the 2nd Division of the 3rd Corps in the Peninsula Campaign. During this time, Hooker earned the reputation of an aggressive leader who cared for the welfare of his men. Hooker led the 1st Corps at Antietam under McClellan, where he injured his foot. When McClellan failed to pursue Lee's army after Antietam, Lincoln replaced him with Major General Ambrose Burnside, which we will talk about later. Following a loss at Fredericksburg and a series of poor decisions, Lincoln removed Burnside, promoting Hooker to the commander of the Army of the Potomac in early 1863. As commander of the Army of the Potomac, Hooker improved conditions for the soldiers, including food, there's more, medical care, and leave. However, disagreements with his staff and commanders, along with a loss to Confederate Commander General Robert E. Lee at Chancellorsville, Virginia, led to Hooker's resignation as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. His army, and in the summer of 1863, transferred with the 6th and 7th Corps to the Western Theater with the Army of the Cumberland. Hooker had success at the Battle of Chattanooga and the Battle of Lookout Mountain. I'm giving him 3 stars because he improved working conditions for soldiers. However, he made poor decisions and had disagreements with his staff. The next man that had a huge influence on our country is General McClellan's replacement, General Ambush, and here he is, General Ambush Burnside. General Burnside began his military career of varied success after graduating 18 in a class of 47 from the United States Military Academy in 1847. He received a brevet 2nd lieutenant position in the 2nd Artillery and served during the Mexican-American War, mostly on garrison duty. After the Mexican-American War, he briefly served in garrison duty in the southwestern U.S. and resigned his commission in 1853. He was appointed as a Major General of the Rhode Island Military and received a nomination to Congress. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Burnside organized the 1st Rhode Island Infantry, which was one of the first units to arrive in Washington and offered the capital protection. Burnside's success earned him a promotion to Major General of Volunteers, and the bulk of his force was transferred back to George McClellan's Army of the Potomac. During this time, Burnside, known as an exceedingly modest man, twice turned down an opportunity to succeed McClellan as head of Union forces. That's very modest, in my opinion. In March of 1863, Burnside was given command of the Department of the Ohio. During his command, he arrested ex-Congressman Clement L. Vallandigham. We will talk about him later too. Just saying. He's not very good. So he arrested him for making seditious comments. I gotta get up. In autumn of 1863, Burnside successfully commanded his troops against Confederate General James L. Longstreet. Burnside was able to outmaneuver Longstreet and successfully held on to the city of Knoxville until Union reinforcements under William T. Sherman, we'll talk about him next, arrived and forced Longstreet to retreat. I'm giving him 4 stars because he was unsuccessful in the Battle of Fredericksburg and made a series of poor decisions, but he almost got 5 because he did good. He just made that one mistake. I'm giving General Sherman 5 stars because he was a great military leader, and so far he has accomplished many victories. Unlike many of his colleagues, he did not fight in the Mexican-American War, serving in California instead. He resigned his commission in 1853. Then, Sherman took work in the fields of banking and law briefly before becoming the superintendent at the Louisiana Military Academy in 1859. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Sherman resigned from the academy and headed north, where he was made a colonel of the 13th United States Infantry. He first saw combat at the Battle of First Manassas, where he commanded a brigade of Tyler's division. Although the Union Army was defeated during the battle, President Abraham Lincoln was impressed by Sherman's performance, and he was promoted to brigadier general on August 7, 1861. He was sent to Kentucky to begin the Union task of keeping the state from seceding. Sherman was promoted to Major General of Volunteers on May 1st of 1862. After the Battle of Shiloh, Sherman led troops during the battles of Chickasaw Bluff and Arkansas Post, and commanded 15 corps during the campaign to capture Vicksburg. At the Battle of Chattanooga, Sherman faced off against Confederates under Patrick Cleburne in the fierce contest at Missionary Ridge. After Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to commander of all the United States armies, Sherman was made commander of all troops in the west of the Union. In my opinion, he has done a great job at living up to the expectations that came with his responsibility. Unlike all of the other men, this man has influenced our country in a horrible way. This man is Clement Vallandigham. And I'm giving him 1 star. If I could give 0, I would give 0, because, yeah. Vallandigham was in the House of Representatives until this past year. He began making vigorous speeches in Ohio against the war and the government. He soon grew to be one of the most suspected and hated men in the North. He was arrested in May by military authorities for expressing treasonable sympathy with the enemy. He was tried and found guilty by a military commission and was sentenced to imprisonment. Soon after, President Lincoln commuted his sentence to banishment behind Confederate lines. Vallandigham made his way to Canada, where he continued his campaign of harassment from across the border. In September 1863, the Ohio Peace Democrats, otherwise known as Copperheads, nominated him for governor. But Union military victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July ensured his decisive defeats at the polls. The last person on our list is Robert Gould Shaw, and this man definitely deserves 5 stars. In my opinion, he's my favorite man on this list. On May 28th of this past year, Shaw led the 54th in a triumphant parade through Boston to the docks, where the regiment departed for service in South Carolina. Shaw had married Annie Nealon Haggerty just 26 days before. The 54th did not see real action until a skirmish with Confederate troops at James Island on July 16th. 2 days later, Shaw and his men were among the units chosen to lead the assault on Battery Wagner, part of the defenses of Charleston. Shaw was killed in the charge, bravely urging his men forward, but the 54th had proven that they were as brave as anyone, black or white. Confederate General Johnson Hagood refused to return Shaw's body to the Union Army, and to show contempt for the officer who led black troops, Hagood had Shaw's body buried in a common trench with his men. Rather than considering this a dishonor, Shaw's father proclaimed, and I quote, "We would not have this body removed from where it lies, surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers. We can imagine no holier place than that in which he lies, among his brave and devoted followers, nor wish for him better company. What a bodyguard he has." I'm Avery Thorne, and this has been Channel 63 News.
And now, to you, Anna, our political and foreign affairs expert.
Go.
Good evening. I'm Anna Smith from Channel 63 News. Walk with me. Now, for the Gettysburg Address. It took 17 acres to bury all the men that were killed during the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln developed a speech of only 10 sentences talking of the common courage and sacrifices of both the North and South. During the speech, Lincoln explained, "The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." A direct excerpt from the Gettysburg Address. Another personal insight was from a soldier during the battle. He says, "The mass of wounded and heaps of dead entangled the feet of the contestants, and underneath the trampling mass, wounded men who could no longer stand struggled, fought, shouted, and killed, hatless, coatless, drowned in sweat, black with powder, red with blood. With fiendish yells and strange oaths, they blindly piled the work of slaughter." A Union soldier described the high water mark of the Confederacy as such. In 1862, Lincoln wanted to avoid the topic of slavery because of his fear that British intervening in the war would cause the Confederates to win. The Union was also conflicted with Britain, as Britain was, and I quote, constructing two beautiful boats for the Confederacy after Lincoln had expressed for them not to do so. The Union ambassador to England wrote a letter expressing that there would be a war with Britain if they didn't stop from the boats heading south, so Britain pulled out the boats at last minute. Britain considered helping the South if they were able to win a battle in northern ground, since the South had won an earlier battle in the South areas. However, Britain remained neutral because the Confederates were not able to do so. Russia's incline to favor the North also persuaded Britain to remain uninvolved. Okay, Lincoln states that his sole objective is to save the Union, not the slaves, as stated. "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that." This was Lincoln to Horace Greeley, of a newspaper editor, after the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, all slaves in rebel-controlled territories would be free. It excluded slaves in the Union border states and Confederacy, so it did not end up freeing a lot of the slaves where they needed to be freed. Lincoln was successful. Britain did not recognize the Confederacy, and thousands of blacks joined the Union forces. Lincoln sought the proclamation as an emergency act. Otherwise, he would not have the power to make such a drastic change without Congress. He knew that it was unlikely for the freed blacks to be re-enslaved, and the proclamation, I think there's a bug in my eye. Proclamation was a huge step to the elimination of slavery in America. Now for the politics of our last year. Politics during 1863 were ran very similarly in both the South and the North. For example, both are governed by a president. Jefferson Davis in the South, and Lincoln, as we all know, in the Union. Both presidents relied heavily on volunteers to help them in Union and Confederacy forces. The economy had fallen because of the loose control while dealing with wages, profits, and prices, except on the railroads, as seen. Both presidents tried to resolve this issue by creating their own currencies, creating a huge inflation. Nowadays, in the South, a barrel of flour is selling for $1,000. Both leaders were faced with many unloyal government officials and faced personal attacks. And with the election of 1864, many Confederates wanted Robert E. Lee to become a dictator of the South, against all morals upon which America had made itself. Copperheads were also formed during the time, and they were known as Peace Democrats. Any citizen in the North who opposes the war policy and advocates restoration of the Union through a negotiated settlement with the South joins this political party today. By January 1863, their assaults on Lincoln, combined with poor performance of the armies, were taking a toll on civilian morale. Midwesterns spoke openly about seceding and establishing a new country or aligning with Confederate States of America because of Lincoln. I'm Anna Smith. This is Channel 63 News. Thank you for watching.
And now, live, here's Davis, our military expert.
Thanks, Sydney. Welcome back to Channel 63 News. I'm Davis Beasley, the military expert, here to update you on all the major events, battles, and people that made 1863 special. Many lower and middle class citizens were disappointed earlier this year due to the passing of the Conscription Act, America's first military draft. This act stated that all men between the ages of 20 and 45 must enlist immediately. However, if they can afford it, one could pay an exemption fee of $300. However, many lower and middle class men can't afford it, which caused many draft riots, especially in New York City. These riots began on July 13th in New York City and finally ended on July 16th. However, over 3,000 people were left homeless and millions of dollars of damages have been caused. Over the year, there were several influential Union leaders, and today we're here to discuss the legacies of General Ambrose Burnside and General William T. Sherman. Burnside, a well-known Union leader, politician, and military officer, fought his first Civil War battle at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, then led an expedition in North Carolina and fought during the Battle of Antietam, then was put in charge of the Union Army in 1862. Burnside was removed from the Union Army after its embarrassing defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg this past year. William T. Sherman was a Union general in the Civil War and one of America's greatest military leaders, who was chosen to be commander in 1862 and constantly impressed President Lincoln. These two men, along with many others, made positive contributions to the Union Army and deserve to be recognized for their dedication and desire to fight. The first battle we're here to talk about is the Battle of Chancellorsville, which occurred in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. On April 30th, General Joseph Hooker, who had just been recently chosen by President Lincoln to be the Union commander, led his army across the Rappahannock River and reorganized on Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army, who decided to fight back rather than retreat. A week later, Hooker surrendered to Lee, resulting in a major victory for the Confederacy and an embarrassing loss for the Union. The battle resulted in over 30,000 soldiers dead, injured, or missing, and over 17,000 soldiers being part of the Union Army. Unfortunately, after this battle, Hooker was forced to retire because of embarrassment. The next major battle many are still talking about is the Battle of Gettysburg. Over the summer, Robert E. Lee and his army were seen crossing Philadelphia, hoping to defeat the Union Army on their own soil. On July 1st, Lee met General George G. Meade, Hooker's replacement. Meade squashed the plans of Lee and the rest of the Confederate Army and defeated them on July 3rd, and his second attempt at invading the North failed. During this battle, around 51,000 men were found dead, injured, or missing, and over 28,000 men happened to be Confederate. Another major battle that occurred this year was the Battle of Vicksburg. On May 18th, Union General Ulysses S. Grant took his army to Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, hoping to trap and defeat Confederate General John Pemberton. On May 20th, Grant besieged Vicksburg, and after 40 days, Pemberton finally surrendered. This recent battle was significant because the Union Army now gained control of the Mississippi River. During this battle, over 37,000 men were killed, injured or missing, and over 32,000 being Confederate.